In the early hours of the 2nd of December 1984, the deadliest industrial disaster occurred in the Indian city of Bhopal. The Union Carbide India Limited pesticide company leaked around 40 tons of deadly chemicals into the surrounding city, killing thousands within hours. Many of those who died were killed in their sleep, died fleeing, or were children. Hundreds of thousands were exposed. Many children have since been born with congenital conditions, and many have not been able to achieve a sense of closure or justice. In today's video, we will cover what led to the disaster, its impact, and how those responsible have largely evaded meaningful justice. It is perhaps helpful to start with the Union Carbide India Limited and its controlling party, Union Carbide Corporation. In 1934, the American company entered the Indian market and set up the Indian Limited Company. On the proviso that much of the funding were to come from India, Union Carbide would have the controlling share, being in control of 50.9%. The remainder would be held by the Indian government and Indian banks and investors. All manner of chemicals were produced for use in batteries, plastics, and pesticides. During the 1960s, there was an increase in demand for food in the face of shortages. In 1969, Bhopal was selected for the site of a pesticide production plant. The city was one of the fastest growing in India. Haphazard slums and hutments would surround the site of the plant, but it was a growing economic hub in central India. The plant produced pesticides by the name of Sevin and Temic for consumer use, with customers being individual farmers. These would be made with imported components that would be mixed together on site, one key ingredient being methyl isocyanate. Methyl isocyanate is a colorless, odorless, and flammable liquid, capable of reacting with water. It is also incredibly toxic to humans, and a severe irritant. In 1979, the Bhopal site would begin production of its own methyl isocyanate, storing tens of thousands of liters of the chemical in 3 large, pressurized containers. However, by the 1970s, many farmers opted to use cheaper, local alternatives to the pesticides, whilst foreign, cheaper-made pesticides were starting to become available. As demand fell, so did the profits, and the standards at the plant. The numbers of workers and supervisors was slashed in half, and when repairs were made to the facility, cheaper, less effective parts were used. As many of the higher skilled, experienced workers saw the writing on the walls and left, they were replaced with poorly trained, less experienced workers. Even running at less than half its full capacity, it could not become profitable. In 1981, a worker at the site died following exposure to phosgene gas. With an unmotivated, ill-equipped workforce and an unprofitable output, the Union Carbide sought to sell the plant. Towards the end of 1984, the plant sought to use its supplies to make as much methyl isocyanate as possible. This was stored on site, split 40 tons into one container and around 22 tons in another. On the 2nd of December, the shift supervisor at the plant ordered that the various pipes to the methyl isocyanate containers be cleaned. This was done with water, aiming to deal with corrosion that built up. Unfortunately, a number of safety procedures failed. A slip bind was not inserted into the pipes to ensure that the water did not leak into the storage tanks. The bleeder valves at the bottom of the pipes that would have let the water escape were blocked, meaning that the water ended up in the methyl isocyanate containers. This was possible as either due to human error or mechanical fault, with an isolation valve left open. When the water mixed with the methyl isocyanate, it caused an exothermic reaction. When the employee carrying out the cleaning realized this, he reported the problem to his supervisor, who instructed him to continue. At around 11 PM, the pressure in the tank began to increase rapidly. However, the readings were ignored, put down to just an ever-common mechanical fault at the plant. At around 11:30 PM, a gas leak was discovered, and steps were taken to deal with it. However, the staff at the plant on shift decided to fully fix the problem only after their scheduled tea break. When the situation was next checked, the pressure readings were off the chart, and were well above what could be expected for a mere mechanical fault. Attempts were made to deal with the problem with both caustic soda and by venting the gas through a vent stack. However, both failed to operate properly, meaning the methyl isocyanate escaped into the atmosphere. Whilst attempts were made to divert the chemical to other tanks, these were too full, and the effort failed. At around 12:40, the alarms were sounded throughout the plant, though the alarm that would alert those outside the plant was soon turned off. The methyl isocyanate was sprayed into the air for around 2 hours, with 40 tons expelled. The gas cloud that fell on the sleeping citizens was not only made up of methyl isocyanate, but also included chloroform, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen chloride. At around 1 AM, those awake started to smell something wrong. Those who were exposed to the gas would experience all manner of symptoms. Coughing, eye irritation, and pains in the throat and stomach were common. Those affected would struggle to breathe and vomit following the exposure. Parents were awoken to the sounds of their children coughing, including one survivor named Aziza. She was awoken to the sound of her 3-year-old daughter coughing, and soon the room was filled with the white smoke. From outside, she heard others shouting to run, as her family all succumbed to the toxic gas. Her 8-month-old son fell unconscious. As they fled through the streets, Aziza saw others attempting to flee, but many fell unconscious directly affected by the gas. As they fled, the children vomited, whilst Aziza could not fully control her bowels. At one point, Aziza recalls falling and realizing she had miscarried. Thankfully, she and her family survived the ordeal, but many more were not so lucky. Aziza is but one of the survivors. A link to the experiences of others will be available in the pinned comments. By the morning, it is thought that thousands died. Many choked to death, either in their sleep or whilst attempting to flee. As the gas was denser than air, it affected those who were lower to the ground, such as children. At the time of the leak, Bhopal did have 4 large hospitals, but these hospitals suffered from both a shortage of physicians and hospital beds. There was also no mass casualty emergency response system in place in the city, with the police response being panicked and not many people fully understanding the situation. In large part, this was due to the staff of the plant withholding information from the police for quite some time. But the damage and trauma were not restricted to that night alone. The consequences for those affected would last decades. It is thought that over 555,000 people who survived the gas leak were left with some form of injury, though the exact number is not known and could be much higher. Children born to those affected by the gas leaks have been reported to suffer with higher rates of congenital issues. Many suffer from seizures, have delayed development, or tragically died shortly after birth. All manner of cancers, notably of the eyes, tongue or bladder, would come to affect the survivors of the gas leak. Research from the Samba Havana Clinic, a charity that supports the survivors of the gas leak, indicates that survivors have 10 times the rate of cancer compared to the others. A link to the clinic's website will be in the pinned comments. In March of 1985, the Indian government passed a law allowing it to represent the victims of the gas leak. Whilst the matter was first to be heard in American courts, the matter was transferred to Indian jurisdiction. The case was eventually settled out of court in 1989. With the Union Carbide Corporation paying $470 million, with additional funds from both the American and Indian companies going towards the hospital in Bhopal. The Union Carbide Corporation also accepted moral responsibility for the gas leak, though not legal responsibility. The American company was quick to point out that despite having the controlling share of the Indian company, the Bhopal plant was managed and operated by Indian citizens, as a means to dissociate itself from the responsibility for the gas leak. It was even suggested that the leak was only possible if the plant had been sabotaged. The compensation awarded was an average amount of $2,200 to each of the families who had lost someone. Such compensation, whilst low when compared to what might be expected in an American court, was well above what would be expected in the Indian courts. This was a position reaffirmed in a 2023 ruling by the Indian Supreme Court following attempts to obtain more compensation for the victims of the gas leak. The calculation for compensation was based on figures of those who died being around 3,000, but estimates to the actual total of those who died over the next few years are as high as 15,000. In 1986, the Bhopal plant was shut down with some of the pipes and tanks being sold overseas. The Union Carbide Corporation sold its shares of the Indian company and insisted that the out-of-court settlement was the end of its responsibility. The site, however, has since become dilapidated, and the ground and water surrounding it have become contaminated. The rusted site is but a grim reminder of the gas leak. The Indian government did, however, attempt to hold the management of the Union Carbide criminally accountable. When the CEO, Warren Anderson, arrived in India on the 7th of December 1984, he was placed under house arrest by the Indian authorities and charged with manslaughter. Anderson was allowed to return to the United States, promising that he would come back to India. Yet, when India issued requests to extradite him, they were denied by the US government. The reason given was that there was insufficient evidentiary links between Anderson and the gas leak. Anderson would never face any criminal proceedings for his company's role in the disaster. It would not be until June of 2010 that 7 former high-ranking employees of Union Carbide India Limited were convicted of causing death by negligence. They received light sentences of only a few $1,000s fine each and 2 years imprisonment, and were released on bail shortly after sentencing. The Bhopal gas leak ought to be forever tied to Union Carbide, who were bought out by Dow Chemical in 1999 for $11.6 billion. The neglect before, during, and after the disaster should never be forgotten. The disaster highlights how expanding into developing countries without proper safety standards can lead to dire consequences. For the hundreds of thousands poisoned and traumatized by one of, if not the worst industrial disaster, the fight for justice and proper restitution is an ongoing battle. Far too many have been left with debilitating conditions and cancers, with many passing on developmental issues to the next generation.